You're a new college student in 2025. You want connection, recognition, maybe even future career leverage. Do you rush a fraternity, knowing recent transparency investigations have tallied hundreds of hazing incidents in recent years, with long-running databases documenting hundreds of fatalities across history, and with new federal reporting rules just beginning under the Stop Campus Hazing Act? Or do you walk past and risk losing access to an instant tribe? It isn't just a campus choice, it's a psychological question. The same forces that once kept secret societies alive still pull students forward. And that's where the paradox begins. The paradox of belonging. Every fall, the cycle repeats itself. News breaks about hazing-related hospitalizations or tragic deaths. Parents call universities demanding action, and yet recruitment tables still draw long lines. High-profile tragedies clearly dent reputations, yet recruitment remains resilient on many campuses, and research shows several psychological forces explain why. In 2025, participation in Greek life is still widespread, with roughly 750,000 students nationwide involved across hundreds of campuses. On the surface, that seems puzzling. Why would students continue to commit to organizations that attract such intense scrutiny? The answer lies in the paradox of belonging. Human beings are wired for community. Exclusion isn't just disappointing, it activates the same neural systems that respond to physical pain. Neuroscientists confirm that belonging taps the same pathways linked to both discomfort and reward. For a first-year student arriving on campus, often far from home, that need isn't abstract, it feels immediate. Fraternities hold out what looks like a shortcut: structured companionship, traditions that precede you, and a portable identity that is recognized nationally. It's not only about meeting friends, it's about being able to say, "I know who I am because I'm one of them." For a teenager navigating anonymity in lecture halls and dorms, that sense of claim has enormous weight. So which matters more to a new student? Immediate safety or feeling like they belong? The scale tips quickly when fear of loneliness outweighs fear of risk. One key reason the danger doesn't deter students has to do with perception. A hazing story might dominate headlines, but belonging is personal and urgent. Many students think, "That won't be me. My chapter works differently." Researchers estimate most hazing incidents never even get reported, which helps explain why official statistics understate what actually happens inside chapters. To students, the visible day-to-day culture of bonding and status feels far more real than stories on the evening news. Fraternities also layer exclusivity onto that craving for togetherness. Belonging alone can be found at open dorm events or casual clubs. Greek life, however, insists on tests of loyalty, interviews, rituals, sometimes grueling ordeals. That exclusivity flips danger into evidence of value. Endurance becomes its own form of proof. By suffering through the entry process, members demonstrate commitment, and that makes the resulting acceptance feel rare. Scarcity increases perceived worth, and the fraternity badge becomes something more than friendship. It reads as identity confirmed, which is why selectivity has such a hold on young adults desperate to secure their place. This transformation of hardship into meaning is one of the defining mechanisms at work. From the outside, giving up nights of sleep to carry out trivial tasks looks pointless. But within the group, those sacrifices are markers of passage, elevated into signs that someone truly belongs. The actual pain or exhaustion matters less than the story attached to it. "I endured this, therefore I'm committed." Social identity theory explains how these bonds tighten. People don't just join groups, they internalize them. The fraternity stops being just an association and becomes part of each member's self-definition. That helps explain why membership holds steady despite public scandals. Most students don't calculate risk like a parent or administrator would. They weigh the benefits of inclusion against the possibility of exclusion. And exclusion is always more vivid. Walking into a lecture hall of 200 strangers, wearing a sweatshirt with Greek letters, suddenly transforms anonymity into recognition. You spot others from your chapter, and in that instant, you feel visible, significant. Psychologists describe this fusion of personal and group identity as a direct lift to self-esteem, tied to the status associated with the collective. That recognition can override countless abstract fears. But there's a trade-off. The same force that binds can also blind. When the group's identity becomes intertwined with an individual's sense of self, any threat to tradition feels like a personal attack. That dynamic explains why students sometimes excuse risky or demeaning practices instead of abandoning them. Hazing doesn't weaken connection. Paradoxically, it strengthens it. The brutality itself gets redefined inside the group as evidence of authenticity. From the outside, danger looks like a reason to walk away. From the inside, it feels like a guarantee of meaning. Official surveys reinforce this reality. Many students admit they've seen hazing on campus, yet the overall membership numbers barely shift. Decades of tragic headlines haven't collapsed recruitment. Each new class sees the visible payoff of fraternity membership, social events, networking, recognition, and concludes the risk is acceptable. And when peers also line up, that collective action itself sends a powerful signal. The group is worth it. In practice, danger is not the deterrent outsiders expect, but rather part of the package that makes membership meaningful. What's most striking is how students perceive what's avoidable versus what isn't. Hazing injuries seem rare, framed as edge cases unlikely to strike an individual. Loneliness, by contrast, is something they already see and fear. Being left out feels predictable. For that reason, the motivation to join is less about ignoring risks and more about solving what feels like the most immediate problem in their lives: finding belonging quickly. When measured against that need, nightly chores, grueling rituals, or even physical dangers shrink in significance compared to the certainty of connection. By the time a student has crossed into fraternity life, leaving no longer feels like self-protection. It feels like exile. Membership becomes embedded in personal history, and detaching means dismantling an identity. That's why reform efforts often face resistance, and why news stories rarely empty the lines during rush week. From the inside, the costs have already been transformed into proof of loyalty. From the outside, it looks baffling. Understanding this paradox of belonging clarifies why Greek life endures. It isn't that students are blind to danger, it's that identity and connection hold greater force. But community has never been the only promise fraternities make. To grasp their persistence fully, we also need to ask why secrecy, codes, and rituals held such enduring appeal in the first place. A legacy written in secrets. Fraternities came into being not as random inventions, but as deliberate borrowings from older traditions. Early student groups in the late 18th and 19th centuries styled themselves after civic fraternal orders and honor societies. They borrowed the love of ritual, symbols, and secrecy directly from models already powerful in American society, most famously the Masons. When the first generation of college fraternities appeared, they carried over coded handshakes, passwords, and initiation rites. What began as intellectual or honor societies gradually redefined themselves as social fraternities. This shift placed them squarely in the cultural crosswinds of the early 1800s, when the anti-Masonic movement stirred suspicion about secret associations. Yet secrecy, rather than discouraging participation, seemed to make these campus societies more magnetic. That paradox, watching secrecy alarm outsiders but intensify commitment inside, defined the early reputation of fraternities. A closed ritual in a dimly lit room may have seemed trivial to onlookers, but to the members it conferred meaning. The very act of keeping something hidden made it feel valuable. Secrecy was more than theatrics. It was a mechanism for filtering who truly belonged. Those willing to memorize obscure scripts, guard words at personal cost, and accept rules that outsiders mocked were proving devotion. Social scientists call this costly signaling. The harder the test, the stronger the message. If entry required time, discomfort, or even humiliation, then membership could not be accidental. It had to be earned, and that expense made it treasured. The psychology comes into focus when you imagine a student facing his first initiation. He might not know the reasons for the chants or the history of the symbols, but he knows that others before him endured the same. Emerging afterward, he cherishes membership not because of the ritual's content, but because of the shared cost it required. The secrecy turns private actions into a badge of belonging. Even a simple handshake becomes loaded because it is not available to everyone. Within that framework, traditions do not need rational explanations. The very act of learning and protecting them creates significance. This reliance on secrecy wasn't unique to colleges. Human groups across time have sustained cohesion by creating insider knowledge. Military orders, religious brotherhoods, and civic lodges all made use of symbols and oaths to separate members from outsiders. The psychology is consistent. Knowing something others cannot access affirms you are chosen. But among college students, already in the middle of a demanding transition, the appeal was magnified. Fraternities offered not just friendship, but an identity anchored in mystery. A pin marked with cryptic letters was enough to set someone apart from the anonymous crowd of classmates. Its meaning might not be publicly clear, but the secrecy itself proclaimed value. Resistance came quickly. Universities, churches, and legislatures worried about rival power structures operating out of public sight. In response, some schools banned fraternities altogether, and governors supported legislation to restrict them. But these attempts to stamp them out often had the opposite effect. Repression amplified a law. Students treated prohibition as proof that their societies possessed importance beyond everyday clubs. If secrecy had been attractive before, now it carried defiance as well. Groups leaned further into ritual, nurturing a narrative that they were heirs of a tradition outsiders could not comprehend. For many members, this perception of being both connected to history and embattled in the present deepened commitment. Outsiders often saw theatrics in initiation practices, blindfolds, ropes, chants in dead languages. From a distance it looked absurd, but research on costly signaling explains the staying power. The more nonsensical or uncomfortable the practice, the more investment it demanded. Missing sleep to memorize phrases or suffering small humiliations did not discourage members. It bound them. Dropping out afterward would make those sacrifices feel wasted, so people doubled down on commitment. Thus, the very strangeness of rituals became the reason they mattered. Despite cultural upheavals, the pattern endured. Fraternities survived wars, depressions, enrollment fluctuations, and social reforms while clinging to the devices of secrecy. Other campus groups, debate clubs, student governments, operated openly and offered chances at leadership or recognition. But those lacked the intensity of identity forged in guarded ritual. A fraternity emphasized that membership required more than signing a list. It required passing through secrecy. That difference granted it an aura no ordinary student organization could match. The practice extended beyond ceremonies. Members signaled belonging through discreet gestures. A private handshake, Greek letters stitched on a jacket, or initials engraved in a ring. These created constant reminders of status, visible to insiders, but opaque to outsiders. When members met in new places, those signs confirmed an unseen bond. Such codes linked undergraduates, not only to peers across campuses, but to alumni scattered nationwide. Secrecy stitched together generations, making membership feel like entry into an enduring lineage. Modern culture of instant information might suggest secrecy should crumble, but instead it hardened. Even as hazing reports and misconduct details become public online within hours, fraternities retreat further into coded communication. Outsiders may learn some fragments, yet insiders treat the core experience as intact precisely because it is not shared. Secrecy acts like a protective shell. What outsiders criticize becomes confirmation that only members know the real truth. This sense of privileged access forms part of why fraternities persist even when under constant scrutiny. Psychologists help explain this dynamic. A gesture that anyone could learn holds no prestige. A secret handshake accessible on a website feels empty. But one tied to months of pledging, one sworn never to reveal, is weighty. It carries moral obligation and social pressure. That is the essence of costly signaling. You cannot display loyalty without paying a price, and the price confirms the value. Inside such a system, even silence is meaningful. Keeping quiet in the face of questions becomes part of the identity. The refusal to disclose signals as much as any ritual. This is why Greek organizations are reluctant to surrender secrecy, even though secrecy fuels suspicion. To members, secrecy isn't decorative. It is the very currency of belonging. The rituals, the coded words, the closed doors all remind them that admission required a cost. The higher the cost, the harder it feels to walk away, and the longer the tradition survives. That endurance, however, was never secured by psychology alone. Practical circumstances on campuses soon turned fraternities into more than private clubs. When universities faced surging enrollments and lacked the capacity to handle all the problems that growth created, they discovered these student-run societies could provide an unexpected kind of help. Colleges in crisis, the housing solution. By the early 20th century, universities confronted a challenge far more practical than questions about hazing or secrecy: overcrowding. Enrollment was exploding. Between the late 1800s and the 1920s, the undergraduate population in the United States climbed from just over 60,000 students to around 600,000. Colleges were caught flat-footed. What had once been an elite pursuit for a small demographic was becoming an expectation for a rapidly expanding middle class. Waves of returning veterans after wars, new state investments in land-grant schools, and later the emergence of federal financial aid only intensified the pressure. Every surge of students meant the same problem: not enough beds. Dormitories were slow and expensive to build. They required long lead times, major fundraising campaigns, and huge outlays. Most administrators were not prepared to gamble on large-scale construction when demand was unpredictable. Into this breach stepped fraternities with a simple but crucial offer: their own houses. Funded by members and alumni, run by students, these chapter houses absorbed the overflow that universities could not handle. A single fraternity house might shelter 30 or 40 students. Multiply that across a campus, and you had hundreds of students the university no longer had to house. 4 deans staring at enrollment charts. Fraternity residences looked less like disciplinary problems and more like relief valves. This makes sense of why institutions often tolerated problems they otherwise might have moved against. It wasn't that administrators were blind to the dangers or wholly cynical. They made pragmatic trade-offs. Outsourcing housing was cheaper and faster than building dormitories at scale. While a new residence hall took years and millions in costs, approving the construction of another fraternity house, or simply acknowledging one already built, was nearly free. Universities bought time they desperately needed, financing growth without carrying the debt directly. The pattern crystallized with every new wave of enrollment pressure. In the 1920s economic boom, student bodies swelled. After World War II, the GI Bill brought a tidal wave of veterans into classrooms. Each time, housing fell behind, and fraternities filled the gap. Where campuses had vacant land, alumni funded construction. Where dorms lagged by the hundreds, fraternity brothers simply bunked together in crowded rooms to make space. Administrators often disapproved, but their hands were tied. These houses operated as an unofficial infrastructure program the school didn't have to pay for. That arrangement changed the balance of power. Each fraternity chapter was not just a social club, but also a building that supplied beds, bathrooms, and nightly meals. Removing one meant displacing dozens of students at a stroke, a cost administrators could rarely justify. And alumni who financed these houses were not passive donors. They expected their investments to stand. Pressure from outside and dependency from within made schools reluctant to clamp down too hard, even after high-profile misconduct. This wasn't indulgence, it was structural dependence. As fraternities became landlords, their identity evolved. Early chapters prided themselves on ritual and secrecy, but by mid-century, they were also running kitchens, managing mortgages, and coordinating repairs. Members learned how to handle property taxes alongside pledges and traditions. Living in a fraternity was not a casual add-on, it was central. Sleep, meals, and social life all orbited around the chapter house, which stood as one of the most recognizable buildings on many campuses. A fraternity's presence was visible in bricks and shingles, rivaling or even predating formal residence halls. For today's 18-year-old eyeing fraternity recruitment, it might look like a choice about parties, prestige, or brotherhood. For universities, however, the calculation was practical. Fraternity houses solved a capacity shortage no dean could ignore. The dependence began during moments of crisis, but the pattern stuck even after crises passed. By the time institutions did invest in new residence halls, Greek housing was already embedded in the landscape. Once carried forward by tradition and money, the extra beds remained, reinforcing the system even when financial pressure eased. It is important to be clear, this historical housing crisis doesn't explain fraternity persistence on its own. Psychology, alumni loyalty, and administrative incentives all play roles. Yet the infrastructure solution provides a concrete reason why fraternities outlasted repeated calls for abolition. Students came and went, scandals rose and fell, but the fact remained: fraternity housing sheltered thousands the university could not otherwise accommodate. The benefit was not abstract. Administrators could calculate it directly. Tuition-paying students with a roof overhead at no institutional expense. Membership dues and alumni donations carried the mortgage, not the university budget. In this light, every chapter house was not just tolerated, but integrated as a financial and logistical asset. Even as criticism mounted, boards hesitated to eradicate what functioned like cost-free dormitories. To do so would expose the true scale of the university's reliance. The deeper paradox is that control came at the price of dependency. Outsourcing housing helped universities grow on paper, but it dulled their ability to act decisively when fraternity conduct caused problems. Institutions that outsourced part of their housing network inevitably tied their own operations to the fate of those organizations. That dependency became part of the machinery of higher education itself, and the influence spread outward. Families looking at brochures saw fraternity houses alongside libraries and lecture halls, signals of campus life, even if their child never intended to join. Local housing markets developed around these clusters, shaping towns as much as universities. Over decades, Greek housing ceased to be a side note and became a fixed element of the higher education landscape. What began as an emergency accommodation gradually reshaped how campuses projected themselves and how communities developed around them. So when people today ask why Greek life has endured despite its controversies, housing stands as part of the answer. Universities needed those buildings to survive periods of rapid expansion, and in leaning on them, they created structural incentives to tolerate Greek organizations long past the moments of crisis. The beds fraternities supplied decades ago helped cement their place in campus life, ensuring they were never just extracurricular clubs, but essential parts of the system. Yet housing wasn't the only burden administrators shifted onto fraternities. Beyond providing space, fraternities absorbed another practical function of campus life, one with less to do with bricks and mortar, and more to do with behavior. The discipline shortcut. Managing undergraduates has always meant channeling restless energy, and nowhere is that more concentrated than in 18-year-olds suddenly free from parental oversight. Each fall, thousands arrive eager for outlets, social, physical, and emotional. Universities recognized early that containing this energy would require staffing, supervision, and enforcement capacities on a scale few budgets could support. Instead of expanding bureaucracy, many institutions adopted what became, in practice, a discipline shortcut, letting fraternities police themselves, and by extension their peers. Administrators historically leaned on chapter officers and alumni networks to enforce order, which reduced the need for extra staffing and muted oversight costs. A fraternity was never just a house with beds. Each operated as its own hierarchy with officers, committees, and rules. Leadership roles mirrored small governments: presidents, treasurers, sergeants-at-arms. Within those structures, discipline unfolded daily. A pledge who shirked house duties might be fined or assigned extra work. A member who caused trouble at a party could expect sanctions from peers before anyone outside was notified. Colleges often deferred enforcement to chapters, which meant routine problems could be handled internally until they escalated publicly. It was an improvised but effective system of distributed discipline, keeping day-to-day order without direct institutional involvement. This arrangement answered a practical question: how could administrators maintain control without multiplying staff? Monitoring thousands of undergraduates in dorms, enforcing curfews, refereeing altercations, controlling alcohol, would have required a small army of professionals. Greek housing offered a cheaper alternative. Peer leaders took on the burden, acting as frontline managers of student behavior. Outsourcing discipline lowered short-term costs, but increased the chance of hidden harms, since peer enforcement blurred with hazing and informal punishments that rarely entered official reports. Distance was the real benefit. If fights broke out in a chapter house, deans could wait for fraternity officers or national organizations to respond. If academic performance slipped in one house, the problem was framed as internal rather than a reflection on university policy. Each hour a fraternity president handled disputes was an hour an administrator could redirect elsewhere. By appearing orderly while relying on unpaid student leaders, colleges created the impression of oversight without bearing its expense. Legal complexities of student conduct policies and Good Samaritan rules only reinforced the appeal. Keeping enforcement in Greek houses meant one less layer of liability pressing directly on the school. For members, the system reshaped identity. Fraternities projected themselves as social hubs, but internally they operated like miniature governments. Older brothers instructed, fined, and shamed younger ones. Chapters staged their own hearings, some resembling councils, and others veering toward theatrical judgments. Discipline was rarely gentle. Chores, exclusion, or public reprimands were routine. but the point was to show that responsibility mattered. Being subject to rules enforced by peers gave students authority they would not have held otherwise, while sparing universities the expense of adult supervisors. But the same shortcut also created vulnerabilities. Because peers wielded power, hazing could hide under the guise of discipline. What a university considered self-management might look, in practice, like older members humiliating pledges. Was forcing someone to clean floors at 3 a.m. discipline or degradation? Was yelling through rehearsed rituals a teaching tool or abuse? Administrators sometimes preferred not to know until injuries, emergencies, or headlines forced attention. Until then, the shortcut delivered exactly what institutions wanted: order at low cost, invisible to official ledgers. To outsiders, it often seemed as if fraternities got away with too much because colleges lacked courage to intervene. The truth was more structural. Universities needed them as co-managers of student life. In dormitories, misconduct could flow instantly into administrative files. In fraternity houses, many conflicts stayed within chapter walls, delayed or diffused long before they could spark formal cases. That delay protected the school. Everyday disruptions never reached trustees' reports or parents' calls, and even when scandals eventually surfaced, they represented isolated eruptions rather than a constant stream of minor violations. Psychologically, the arrangement entrenched fraternity pride, being trusted to govern their own heightened defensiveness against external criticism. Members saw themselves not merely as participants in a club, but as stewards of order on campus. When administrators or outsiders questioned Greek traditions, brothers interpreted it as an attack on independence and responsibility they believed they had earned. This perception deepened commitment. To dismantle fraternities was to dismantle part of the campus governance structure itself. These traditions hardened over generations. Chapters still instruct new officers each year in hearing disputes, enforcing fines, or running standards boards. Some practices approach professional routines, echoing corporate committees. Others resemble ad hoc courts guided by social pressures. Either way, the effect is the same. Enforcement begins inside the chapter before the university intervenes. That dual system is efficient on paper. Colleges promote student leadership while quietly sidestepping the full cost of monitoring restless young adults. Most students aren't aware this bargain exists. Ask undergraduates, and they talk about traditions, social life, or lifelong bonds. Ask administrators formally, and they cite alumni donations or campus spirit. But behind these explanations lies the unspoken calculation. It is cheaper and less politically costly to let fraternities regulate themselves than to build new enforcement systems. Outsourced discipline doesn't appear in glossy brochures, but it has shaped student experience for decades. This produced a hybrid reality. Universities projected an image of carefully managed institutions where deans secured order. Inside fraternities, peer authorities set rules, enforced punishments, and kept behavior aligned with group expectations. Parents saw polished administrators. Members saw pledge masters keeping them in line. Both sides accepted the system because it worked. Colleges controlled expenses, and fraternities reinforced their own legitimacy by exercising authority. Even as scandals forced occasional reforms, the logic persisted. Universities needed someone to regulate students day to day. Fraternities filled that role for free. Colleges gained a buffer from constant misconduct reports, while Greek chapters solidified their place as fixtures of campus life. The trade was never perfect. Peer enforcement couldn't prevent every risk, but it was durable because both sides benefited. Outsourcing discipline was more than cost-cutting. It was structural dependency. That dependency explains why proposals to abolish fraternities routinely stall. Eliminating them would require institutions to reclaim full responsibility. Staff would need to take on roles long held by chapter officers. Dorms would require new monitoring systems. Budgets already stretched thin would absorb fresh costs. Universities hesitate, and in that hesitation the shortcut survives. Greek houses functioning as unpaid management teams embedded deeply in campus systems. In the end, discipline in fraternities went beyond keeping order in living spaces. It became the mechanism through which universities offloaded chaos management onto students themselves. Outsourcing created efficiencies, but also hid risks, embedding fraternities in the machinery of higher education. Their persistence is tied not only to tradition or alumni pride, but to this ongoing role in maintaining practical control. And that role ripples outward. When brothers enforced rules, they weren't just maintaining order. they were reinforcing hierarchies. Power flowed downward from officers to pledges, and compliance defined status inside the house. That same dynamic helps explain another question outsiders often ask. If hazing looks humiliating or senseless, why do students tolerate it at all? The status game. Inside fraternities, the driving force is not just belonging, it's competition for rank. This is the status game, where every ritual or hardship becomes part of a system that decides who matters most. Outsiders often see hazing as pointless or cruel, but among members it gets reinterpreted as an investment. Each demand, each act of compliance earns credibility, and credibility translates into influence. Rather than being random suffering, hazing functions like deposits into a shared account, one that pays out recognition, privileges, and opportunities later. What makes this logic powerful is how status operates as social currency. Psychologists studying social identity theory note that people tie their self-worth to the groups they claim, and inside those groups, prestige distributes value much like money. For fraternity members, status can mean more than just approval. It often feels like access to wealth in a different form. The network, the reputation, the doors that open once you're recognized. That's what many members mean when they talk about earning their place. Status builds into social capital, a mix of respect, reputation, and connections that carries benefits well beyond the chapter house. This mechanism isn't unique to college Greek life. Military recruits endure boot camps filled with exhaustion and humiliation. Sports teams condition rookies with drills and hazing traditions, and countless. Cultures embed passage rituals that hinge on hardship. The through line is that temporary pain can be reframed as evidence of value. Within fraternities, this comparison provides logic. Surviving something difficult becomes proof you deserve recognition. A pledge who complies isn't just showing obedience. He's building credit that others will acknowledge with loyalty and respect later. The effect grows inside the fraternity's hierarchy. Membership is not flat. New pledges enter at the bottom, with duties that advertise their lower rank. They run errands, perform chores, and absorb sharp reminders of their position. Yet within a year, they often move into positions of authority, reversing the dynamic as they direct the next round of recruits. That fast rotation makes the burden feel temporary but necessary. Today's tasks are tomorrow's ticket upward, and members endure them with the expectation that the balance of power will soon flip. For many, that expectation is less degrading than motivating. Daily life under one roof magnifies the stakes. Unlike casual campus clubs, fraternities compress work, leisure, and social interaction into the same corridors and kitchens. In such a tight environment, status is constantly visible. Authority affects who does cleanup, who controls house spaces, or who gets priority at social events. Even minor privileges, choosing a bedroom, inviting a guest, setting the playlist, signal hierarchy. Because everyone shares the same roof, those signals are unavoidable. Each reminder strengthens the sense that enduring a lower rung is worthwhile, because the climb is close at hand. On a neurological level, prestige and recognition light up the brain's reward pathways. Researchers describe honor and reputation as drivers on par with material resources. For undergraduates navigating large campuses where anonymity can feel suffocating, fraternity status brings a real lift in self-esteem. Being recognized within a campus of thousands translates into daily validation. That reinforcement is not subtle. It's visible during meetings that cheer someone's promotion, events where leaders host exclusive gatherings, and ceremonies that mark transitions from pledge to member. Members learn quickly that status delivers concrete psychological rewards. Fraternity status doesn't stop at the campus gates. Letters stitched into a sweatshirt or printed on a jacket carry recognition across schools and cities. Encountering another student, or even an alumnus, with the same symbols often produces instant rapport. Alumni interviews, professional networks, and even casual encounters grant credibility when those shared letters appear. In this way, the local ladder of hazing and hierarchy sustains a much wider structure, prestige that extends into life after college. For many, the promise of future opportunity transforms short-term hardship into a rational, if painful, choice. Still, the system complicates the difference between genuine accomplishment and manufactured rank. Recognition is not awarded for solving a problem, excelling academically, or building skills. It comes from compliance and endurance. Within a fraternity, that distinction rarely matters. Hierarchy gains legitimacy through reinforcement, repetition, and symbols. Rituals remind pledges of their low status and affirm seniors' higher rank. Even chants and slogans operate as constant signals of standing. This routine embeds the hierarchy so firmly that members stop questioning whether the metrics of prestige reflect actual merit. It is from this angle that outsiders often find fraternity culture so perplexing. Watching someone scrub floors at midnight or endure verbal drills seems exploitative. Inside the system, however, that same student feels like he is purchasing his way into credibility, paying dues in a market where credibility is scarce. Anthropologists describe this pattern across history. Societies use pain, tests, and restriction to validate those who endure. From fasting to scarification, initiation often turns hardship itself into the road toward prestige. Fraternities mirror that blueprint in miniature, with hazing as the price of belonging. Consider also the evidence about effects beyond culture. While critics emphasize drinking, injuries, or academic decline, some studies report the opposite in certain contexts. At several campuses, fraternity members show higher retention and graduation rates compared to non-members. This pattern is not universal, but it reveals how the status game can generate indirect benefits. Students who feel anchored in a prestige-rewarding environment sometimes persist longer in school. The very mechanisms outsiders label irrational can, at times, create stability inside otherwise shaky undergraduate journeys. The consequence is that hazing often persists even under pressure to reform. To administrators, risks overshadow rewards. For many students inside the ladder, hazing feels like the foundation of the system. Remove it, and you flatten prestige. Without that shared test of endurance, recognition seems unearned, and membership loses its scarcity. This is why attempts to abolish hazing usually see it resurface in altered forms under new names. The prestige economy depends on entry costs, and groups find ways to preserve them. What ultimately secures fraternity rituals is the validation cycle. Enduring hardship alone would mean little if others didn't recognize and reward it. What transforms a night of harassment into a badge of honor is the acknowledgement afterward. The vote to initiate, the applause, the public declaration of inclusion. This social recognition converts private pain into visible gain. Without it, rituals would collapse into farce. With it, they persist as currency in the fraternity economy. Yet the payout isn't consistent for everyone. Those who rise into officer positions or lead chapters reap the clearest returns. Influence, control, and visibility that can extend beyond campus. Others who leave early or remain at the margins often come away only with the costs. Still, the presence of visible winners keeps new members invested. Watching seniors command respect reinforces the idea that the path from pledged duties to prestige is worth following, even if not all succeed. The evidence on the ground, status, influence, connections, becomes more persuasive than abstract warnings. In this way, fraternity status mirrors the wider world. Corporate promotions, military ranks, and even government offices reinforce hierarchy with symbols, uniforms, and privileges. Endurance at the bottom is rationalized by the expectation of reward at the top. Fraternities condense this into a brief undergraduate span, making movement up and down the ladder swift and highly visible. The experience is compressed, but the psychology, costly signaling, identity built through prestige, remains consistent with the world beyond college. For many students, this pursuit of recognition explains why questionable or uncomfortable behaviors persist. They see prestige as the return waiting at the top and treat hardship as an entry fee. From the outside, the risks dominate. From the inside, the currency of recognition makes risks bearable. That dynamic reveals why the pursuit of status continues to sustain fraternity culture, even when danger is obvious. But there is another force at work that keeps members committed, even when they realize the sacrifices aren't paying off in the ways they expected. The explanation lies not only in hierarchy, but in how human minds respond to loss, cost, and dissonance. Cognitive biases at work. Why do students continue pledging, even when grades slip, nights spiral into chaos, or hazing crosses the line from uncomfortable to dangerous? Walking away looks like the obvious choice, yet they stay. Not always because of loyalty or love for tradition, but because of the way human thinking bends under pressure. Built-in cognitive biases shape decisions in ways that make persistence feel logical, even when outcomes suggest otherwise. These aren't random quirks. They are reliable patterns that tilt judgment and help explain why fraternity membership often outlives rational analysis. Take the sunk cost fallacy. Once someone has put in time, effort, or pain, quitting feels like discarding that investment. Rationally, the past shouldn't control the future, but in practice, it does. If you've ever refused to leave a bad movie just because you paid for the ticket, you know the pull. A pledge who spent weeks running errands at 3 a.m. will hesitate to walk out, because leaving would make the humiliation feel meaningless. The suffering itself becomes a reason to keep going. Cognitive dissonance adds another layer. People want their beliefs and actions to align. When they clash, the brain finds ways to resolve the tension. A student who sees himself as independent but submits to degrading chores faces conflict. To square the circle, he reinterprets the mistreatment as valuable. This must matter, or why would I endure it? Many students rationalize or reinterpret harm as meaningful rather than meaningless, a predictable cognitive response that protects pride. The discomfort gets reframed as proof of strength or worth. Confirmation bias then filters what students pay attention to. Once someone decides to rush, they start scanning for evidence that justifies the choice and ignoring what doesn't. Horror stories about hazing in the news? Those other chapters must just be reckless. Alumni who landed great jobs? Proof it'll pay off. Casual conversations with peers heading into recruitment only reinforce the decision. Every supporting scrap strengthens belief, while risks fade into the background. Peer influence cements the illusion with the bandwagon effect. On a campus where freshmen line up at recruitment tables, the sheer visibility of participation makes it appear safe and normal. If dozens of classmates are putting on rush shirts, joining feels inevitable. Safety in numbers reduces doubt, even though the hazards are unchanged. The crowd itself becomes reassurance that nothing is wrong. And then there's loss aversion. Humans hate giving up what they already have more than they enjoy gaining something new. Once someone is inside a fraternity, leaving means losing meals, friendships, networks, and the identity those letters represent. Gaining time for academics or space for safer friendships doesn't always outweigh the sense of loss. The fear of being stripped of belonging can feel sharper than the fear of harm. Together, these biases form a web. First investment makes members reluctant to leave. That investment sparks dissonance, which reframes the hardship as worthwhile. Confirmation bias then stockpiles reasons to stay, while peers rushing nearby normalize the commitment. Fear of losing it all locks the door tight. By the time someone realizes they're falling behind in class or burning out socially, quitting feels less like relief and more like abandoning something hard-won. If you've ever doubled down on a choice just because of what you'd already put in, you know how powerful this cycle can be. Think about that while you listen. Experts estimate that much of what happens never even reaches headlines. A large share of hazing remains unreported, but transparency projects in recent years have still uncovered hundreds of incidents in states where disclosure rules apply. That data suggests the true scope is far broader than most parents or students realize. Against that backdrop, cognitive biases don't just shape choices. They cloak risks by making isolated stories look like exceptions rather than symptoms of a larger pattern. Administrators sometimes assume information alone will change behavior. They publish statistics about GPA drops, suspensions, or hospitalizations. But warnings often bounce off these mental defenses. A pledge already invested interprets the same statistics differently. It won't be me, or our house is safer than theirs. Even strong evidence gets filtered through selective attention and rationalization. From inside, facts do not unsettle commitment. They often reinforce it. For many members, this logic reshapes even the darkest experiences. Hazing that outsiders view as abusive can be reframed as bonding, tradition, or testing. The worse it is, the more meaningful it seems once endured. That's cognitive dissonance in its clearest form. The intensity of the harm is spun into proof of value. Students don't always deny they were hurt. They insist the hurt was necessary. This mental armor makes real reform difficult. Outsiders see a clear path. If fraternities cause harm, stop participating. Insiders view the same harm as proof that membership matters. Many genuinely believe the pain proves they've achieved something that others won't understand. The harsher the treatment, the more sacred the bond. That inversion explains why policies banning hazing often drive the practices underground rather than ending them. Biases also shape perceptions of time. A semester of pledging may only be 15 weeks, but each week of suffering feels like another layer of investment. Every additional night spent in discomfort makes leaving even less thinkable. By the end, staying is not framed as irrational persistence, but as protecting the value of everything already endured. The short, compressed nature of college life makes this cycle more visible. What people experience in jobs or relationships over years plays out in months inside a fraternity house. What's striking is how often members admit the costs. Surveys show many recognize the toll on academics, sleep, and health. Yet instead of spurring exit, those admissions become material for new justifications. I'm learning resilience, or I'm preparing for life beyond campus. Rather than unravel the commitment, awareness strengthens it. That feedback loop explains why dropout rates remain low even during scandal. People reframe what hurts them as what makes it worthwhile. Understanding these mental patterns does not absolve fraternities of harm, but it explains the persistence of loyalty in the face of it. Students aren't staying because they're blind. They're staying because leaving feels worse than continuing, even when continuing is painful. From the inside, the math makes sense. If I keep going, my suffering stays valuable. If I quit, it was for nothing. For outsiders, it's easy to ask, why endure so much for membership that too often delivers chaos? For insiders, the bias is intertwined to turn cost into meaning, making departure not just unattractive, but psychologically unbearable. Risk doesn't repel, it validates. Every bruise, late-night chore, or shouted demand can be repurposed as evidence that the brotherhood is real. That loop doesn't dissolve when graduation arrives. It often sets the stage for what comes next, as the logic of sacrifice and value travels with members, far beyond college walls. And that's where a different kind of force enters the equation. What begins as psychological persistence on campus grows into something longer lasting. An identity that carries into life after graduation, influencing careers, donations, and connections. That continuity raises an important question. What do institutions gain when students who endured the costs remain bound for decades? The alumni effect. Fraternities shape an identity that doesn't end at graduation. What begins as nights of ritual and shared ordeals becomes a label that many carry into adulthood. For colleges, that continuity is not incidental. It is an asset. Loyalty nurtured during undergraduate years often travels forward, influencing alumni choices, careers, and the way they give back to their alma mater. This is the alumni effect. Schools know that fraternity graduates maintain stronger bonds than many of their peers who were never involved in Greek life. Publicly, administrators may condemn chapters for hazing or alcohol violations. They suspend groups, tighten oversight, and issue safety pledges. But beneath the disciplinary language lies another calculation. The very same alumni tied to fraternities are often the ones who stay most committed to the institution. They show up to events, recruit students into jobs, and contribute money at higher rates than the average graduate. Annual studies confirm the pattern. Alumni who participated in Greek organizations report higher attachment to their schools and greater workplace engagement afterward. Most students, once they graduate, let their identification with the college quietly fade. Fraternity alumni experience something different. Regular newsletters, chapter reunions, and donation appeals tied to the hows keep their attachment active. The bond with the fraternity reinforces the bond with the school. Instead of just one tether, they anchor themselves twice, to the campus that granted a degree, and to the organization that shaped their daily life. That dual connection helps explain why Greek networks become durable pipelines of alumni loyalty. This layered loyalty translates into ongoing engagement. A typical graduate might come back for a reunion once in a decade. A fraternity alumnus may return annually, whether for homecoming, chapter anniversaries, or alumni weekends. Each visit creates another moment of renewal, another reminder that the campus is still personally meaningful. Universities depend on such moments because donations flow more consistently from people who feel invested. Development offices recognize this pattern clearly. Greek affiliations often prime alumni to give. Career outcomes extend the advantage. Alumni networks tied to fraternities frequently rival formal university structures in their reach. Younger members find internships, job opportunities, or introductions through older fraternity brothers. Universities benefit indirectly when career placement numbers improve, even when much of the credit belongs to the fraternity network. Administrators see this as evidence that student engagement in Greek life can reinforce positive statistics after graduation, and those improved outcomes become part of institutional marketing. The scale of some organizations amplifies these effects. National fraternities maintain large foundations and membership lists that stretch far beyond individual campuses. Coordinated communication sustains a rhythm of giving and involvement. From the school's perspective, the result is pragmatic. Fraternity alumni are an unusually reliable base of support. That support is not universal. Benefits vary widely by chapter and institution. But on average, the trend is significant enough to shape administrative incentives. This is where the trade-off becomes clear. Administrators do not ignore the risks fraternities create. They are aware of the bad press, the lawsuits, and the tragedies. What they weigh is risk in the present against predictable support in the future. That tension can be captured in one sentence. Administrators balance reputational risk today against predictable alumni support tomorrow. Suspending a house for misconduct may be necessary, but dismantling a system entirely risks alienating graduates who feel their loyalty was forged in those same walls. Families often ask why, given the scandals, schools do not cut ties completely. Part of the answer is that administrators see fraternity alumni as long-term partners. Each time a donor campaign highlights alumni leadership, each time career services point to connections generated through fraternal networks, the argument for preservation gains strength. Universities present reforms as evidence of caution, while continuing to rely on alumni support as a stabilizing factor. For parents evaluating colleges, this context has practical implications. When touring a campus or speaking to admissions staff, it helps to ask not just about current fraternity policies, but also about how the institution documents chapter misconduct and alumni engagement. That dual question provides a clearer picture of how deeply the institution remains tied to Greek life, and what oversight exists beyond promotional claims. The alumni effect also shapes the culture inside chapters. Knowing that an active brotherhood stretches outward into powerful alumni networks makes membership feel like more than a four-year experience. Students see that initiation links them into a lineage that can shape opportunities far beyond the undergraduate moment. Letters on a resume are not just a stamp of campus identity. They are a signal recognizable across industries and regions. That perceived weight strengthens the appeal, even in the face of on-campus risks. Universities, for their part, know they are trading short-term challenges for long-term benefits. Hazing hearings, misconduct boards, and public criticism occupy daily headlines. But alumni loyalty underpins budget projections and long-term planning. Development offices often highlight consistent giving from Greek graduates as evidence of reliable support. Boards of trustees recognize that these pipelines lower fundraising uncertainty. That security makes administrators cautious about severing ties completely, even as critics press for deeper reforms. What emerges is a dual narrative: official disapproval of dangerous practices, paired with quiet dependence on the loyalty those same organizations create. The contradiction frustrates families and reformers, but persists because of tangible results. Universities frame alcohol abuse or hazing incidents as temporary disasters. Alumni loyalty remains a durable resource, lasting decades, supporting endowments and elevating postgraduate statistics. Fraternity alumni themselves often describe their ties as among the most lasting relationships of their lives. That sentiment becomes a cultural and financial resource for institutions. Each reunion attended, each networking event hosted, strengthens the cycle. The fraternity created the identity, but the university reaps the benefit. This interconnectedness helps explain why fraternity systems remain so resistant to abolition. Even when chapters misstep badly, institutions hesitate to dismantle networks that continue to deliver predictable engagement. Instead, reforms are usually designed to keep the infrastructure intact while minimizing visible harm. Critics view the approach as insufficient, but development offices point to long arcs of alumni generosity and career support that reinforce the logic. To understand fraternity persistence, then, one must look less at the weekend parties and more at the ways universities calculate continuity. The alumni effect has become part of the financial and social machinery of higher education. It helps predict which graduates remain connected and which will keep channels of support open long after diplomas are issued. And yet, alumni loyalty does not cancel the fact that student experience in the moment carries its own costs. Fraternities may sow bonds that last decades, but during those undergraduate years, the balance playing out is more immediate. How the pursuit of recognition and belonging intersects with sitting in classrooms, studying, and building a future. That is where another trade-off emerges, one measured not in donations or loyalty, but in grades and academic outcomes. Academic trade-offs. Students arrive at college expecting more than just friends or traditions. They expect to succeed academically. Yet fraternities exist in tension with those academic goals, often celebrated for their networks, but criticized for their distractions. That creates a central question. Does joining strengthen a student's future, or does it weaken their present performance? This trade-off is one of the most debated aspects of Greek life. Research on this point is mixed. Some university studies show short-term drops in GPA during the pledge period, or note that members shift into lighter course loads after initiation. But other large data sets suggest members of fraternities and sororities are more likely to stay enrolled and finish degrees compared to non-members. In some chapters, fraternity GPAs even exceed the campus average. So, outcomes differ by institution and by the culture inside a house. In plain terms, some students take a modest academic hit, while others see benefits in persistence. The reasons behind academic struggles are not hard to trace. Pledging often demands late nights memorizing fraternity history, cleaning duties, or mandatory events that slice into study time. Layer on constant social gatherings, weekend parties, and hours spent recovering, and the equation becomes lopsided. The standard course load doesn't lighten just because someone committed to Greek life. Professors set the same deadlines, the same midterms, and the same essays. By the end of a semester, it makes sense that many pledges report a dip, especially during their first year in a house. What balances against those costs are the long-term career advantages that fraternities promise. Members gain entry into national alumni networks that connect across industries and cities. Those ties can open opportunities for internships, job recommendations, or mentorship conversations that might otherwise feel out of reach. Some longitudinal studies even show that Greek graduates report stronger post-college engagement with their jobs and their schools, reinforcing the sense that the payoff arrives later, not necessarily during the undergraduate years. So the dilemma for a student becomes clear. They must compare short-term academic strain with long-term professional access. In spoken terms, it often comes down to three realities. There are immediate costs to study time and GPA, possible long-term career and networking advantages, and highly variable outcomes that depend on the particular chapter and campus. That calculation is what makes fraternities so polarizing. Inside chapter houses, stories circulate of alumni opening doors in competitive industries, serving as the living proof that the sacrifice is worth it. Members swap examples of brothers securing internships or job interviews through fraternity contacts. These anecdotes function as persuasion. They highlight potential career wins while downplaying the academic struggles along the way. Rarely do students tell stories about lost honors opportunities or scholarships missed due to lower grades. The narrative tilts toward success, creating selective memory that convinces incoming pledges their own gamble will pay off. Yet there are hidden risks. GPA declines, even small ones, can shape opportunities long after college. Graduate programs often impose strict cutoffs that alumni networks cannot override. Entry-level employers who screen transcripts numerically may never hear about fraternity loyalty. For some members, what felt like a smart trade ends up limiting options. And because academic recovery can take years, climbing back from one bad semester is difficult. That structural reality means the gamble is not equally safe for everyone. Still, many members rationalize the dynamic by redefining what counts as intelligence or success. They argue that GPAs measure test performance, while fraternities sharpen real-world skills such as managing obligations, navigating hierarchies, and building social capital. Under that logic, a lower GPA is reframed not as a failure, but as an acceptable exchange for experience they believe will carry weight later in life. Whether that belief proves true varies widely, but it reduces regret in the moment and helps sustain the cycle of recruitment and commitment. Universities themselves contribute to the mixed picture. Administrators publicly promote academic success, yet privately acknowledge that Greek membership can raise retention numbers and strengthen alumni engagement. They tolerate or adjust to the academic drawbacks while benefiting from the stability of higher graduation rates and donor loyalty. To parents, that contradiction can look like negligence, but from an institutional perspective, it is rational compromise. In recruiting, fraternity members do not hide this trade-off. They actively frame it as an investment. Rush events feature testimonials of older brothers who found jobs through alumni ties. For students anxious about the job market in 2025, with escalating tuition, student debt concerns, and unpredictable economic trends, the pitch resonates. Choosing networking insurance at the cost of a half-letter grade feels like a reasonable risk to many. At the same time, students encounter direct reminders of the downside. Emails from professors about poor attendance, missed deadlines, or risk of probation interrupt the fraternity narrative of future advantage. Living between these two realities produces a complicated tension. Daily life means trying to justify time spent at chapter meetings, even as coursework slips. Each student effectively decides whether they can manage both, or whether one sphere must suffer for the other to thrive. One practical point matters most. Results vary dramatically not just by student, but by the chapter culture itself. Some fraternities enforce mandatory study hours, track member GPAs, and celebrate academic scholarships alongside social victories. Others take a more relaxed stance, amplifying the risk of prolonged decline in classroom performance. For students considering recruitment, differences in chapter culture often determine whether the trade-off feels balanced or disastrous. So the academic story of fraternities is not an across-the-board penalty or an across-the-board boost. It is a variable equation shaped by hours spent, chapters joined, and opportunities extended afterward. For some, the results validate the gamble, lower grades offset by career access. For others, the risk never pays off and the costs linger. A practical takeaway helps reframe the choice. If you care about both academics and networks, target chapters with visible academic support. Ask about study hours, GPA monitoring policies, and mentoring structures before committing. The difference between a fraternity that enforces those standards and one that doesn't can prove critical. And that tension, balancing individual progress against collective culture, turns out not to be limited to classrooms or careers. The structures students encounter inside fraternities, ecosystems recognizable far beyond campus, raising a larger question about what these organizations really mirror in the world around us. The mirror for society. Fraternities often appear to be contained within campus life. Brick houses marked with Greek letters, known more for noise than nuance. But what unfolds inside them resonates far beyond college. These organizations don't just reflect student culture. They echo larger structures seen in workplaces, militaries, and religious groups. They condense the patterns of hierarchy, ritual, and loyalty into a 4-year cycle, bringing into sharper focus traits that in the wider world may take decades to reveal. In this way, fraternities act less like anomalies and more like mirrors, showing human social order in fast forward. Hierarchy is the clearest reflection. A fraternity operates on tiers. Pledges at the base, active brothers in the middle, officers at the top. The structure recalls the corporate ladder, entry-level workers managing small tasks, managers enforcing standards, executives setting vision. The psychology tracks the same. Endure the bottom rung with the promise of eventual promotion. What might take decades in a career collapses into semesters inside a chapter house. Sacrifice, compliance, and small privileges stack into authority and recognition. It is a compressed rehearsal of the same ladder students will climb later in jobs or institutions. Ritual stands as the second mirror. The candle ceremonies, chants, and secret scripts may look eccentric, but symbolically they function just like military oaths or corporate onboarding. Each transforms an individual into part of a collective. Social identity theory helps explain why these practices are effective. Belonging becomes more stable when tied to ritual markers. Whether repeating Greek letters or reciting company values, ritual signals that a person has crossed a threshold and now carries a shared identity. In practice, initiation is not about secrecy so much as solidifying belonging. Then comes loyalty, the element that endures long past graduation. Ask fraternity alumni decades later, and many still introduce themselves with their letters. That deep attachment parallels the loyalty of employees to a firm, veterans to their branch, or adherents to a long-held faith. Sacrifice cements identity. Once members have invested time and endured hardship, leaving feels like betrayal. This is less about college tradition and more about the psychology of commitment. We carry forward the identities we paid the highest price to build. Fraternities also reveal how power operates. Authority often flows less from competence than from tenure. Seniors who endured pledging gain authority over newcomers. The cycle repeats. Each cohort inherits the power they once resented. That pattern is not unique to Greek life. It resembles corporate promotion through endurance or political clout gathered through years in rank. The system highlights a blunt truth. Power frequently consolidates by survival, not by merit. What differentiates fraternities is not that they invent these societal structures, but that they accelerate them. Corporations may take decades to produce executives. A fraternity runs the full cycle in a handful of years. The result is a magnified view of hierarchy, ritual, and loyalty. Members watch the entire arc unfold before their eyes, rather than stretched across a lifetime. That compression puts human instincts, obedience, ambition, conformity, under a brighter light. The comparison to cult-like systems often arises, and not without reason. Cults demand sacrifice, administer rituals, and calibrate loyalty through isolation. Fraternities mimic a softer version of that process, demanding commitment, separating insiders from outsiders, and transforming hardship into pride. Outsiders see obedience. Insiders frame the same actions as evidence of belonging. This runs on the same psychological blueprint. Within the campus environment, these dynamics become visible in daily life. Brothers walk with confidence, represent their letters collectively, and act as ambassadors of their group. Similar processes play out in larger arenas. Companies encouraging employees to live the brand, militaries insisting on group cohesion, religions expecting consistency beyond worship spaces. In each case, the identity of the member grows porous, merging with the identity of the group. Fraternities intensify that practice and play it out among young adults who are just learning to define themselves. Critics see in this mirror the darker side of social life. Hierarchies inside fraternities magnify exclusion, reinforcing entitlement or arrogance. Rituals can sanctify harmful behavior under the guise of tradition. Loyalty silences dissent, as members hesitate to shame brothers publicly. Power concentrates in ways that leave the vulnerable unprotected. None of this is exclusive to Greek life, but inside a fraternity, the cycle runs fast enough that cause and effect remain within the same college career. A freshman watches arrogance grow into leadership by the time he graduates. A pledge learns that dissent is punished within months. The acceleration sharpens lessons, sometimes painfully so, that in society may stretch invisibly over years. This is why researchers often describe fraternities as laboratories for social dynamics. They exaggerate what larger systems normalize, allowing outside observers to see clearly how rituals bond, how loyalty conceals flaws, and how hierarchy distributes status, whether deserved or not. Questions such as why do groups cling to outdated traditions, or why will people willingly tolerate harm, find their answers more quickly here than in workplaces or governments, because the intensity and compression strip away excuses. Even something as casual as a party carries weight in this mirror. What outsiders see as reckless hedonism, insiders interpret as structured demonstration of identity and unity. Each keg night amplifies belonging, just as corporate retreats or military exercises build cohesion through shared activity. The setting changes, but the mechanism echoes. If we zoom out further, it becomes clear why these parallels matter. Fraternities persist not just because students value tradition, but because they reveal familiar human instincts. To seek hierarchy, to reinforce belonging through ritual, and to carry loyalty long after it costs us. To watch a fraternity is to watch society in speedrun mode. The same impulses that drive office politics or military camaraderie play out in miniature behind Greek letters. But seeing the mirror raises a deeper question, one that turns the analysis inward. If we recognize these patterns in ourselves, what part of our identity are we handing over to the groups we join? The fraternity may simply make visible choices we all face. When to conform, when to sacrifice, when to obey, and when to walk away. Those decisions may seem sharper in a brick house on campus, but they ripple through every system we enter across life. Fraternities may worry administrators or frustrate parents, yet their value lies in clarity. Behind the controversies, they lay bare truths about human behavior that otherwise hide in slower-moving systems. Hierarchy doesn't vanish when Greek letters fade. It appears in jobs. Rituals shift from odes to orientations. Loyalty migrates from a chapter house to a company or a cause. To look at these organizations is to watch human instincts unfold with unusual speed. That is why Greek life, for all its contradictions, retains significance. It is not just a student subculture, but a lens into how societies function. Its failures echo our wider failures, its structures reproduce our broader structures, and its attachments mirror how we all tie our identities to groups. To observe fraternities is not to watch an odd exception, but to glimpse the everyday processes that bind people everywhere. Recognizing this opens a final challenge. If fraternities accelerate society's dynamics, they also create a stage where choices are made more quickly and their costs show more starkly. For students, that reality doesn't remain abstract. It means weighing affiliation against safety, academic goals, and personal values. The question is no longer just what fraternities reveal about society. It's what those revelations suggest for each individual standing at the edge of a decision-making framework. When a student considers joining a fraternity in 2025, the choice reaches far beyond housing or parties. It's a decision with implications for safety, values, personal identity, and even long-term opportunity. Parents ask it from another angle, whether the potential benefits justify the risks to their child. The clearest way to navigate that question is to use a decision-making framework. Instead of relying on instinct alone, students and families can break the decision into 3 practical steps: risk assessment, value alignment, and bias recognition. Each step offers a one-line action that can be carried out immediately, transforming a vague choice into a deliberate calculation. Risk assessment comes first, because safety has to be addressed before anything else. Fraternities continue to generate reports of hazing incidents, alcohol-related hospitalizations, and dangerous initiations, though the intensity varies widely between chapters. Reform pledges by national organizations exist, but so do chapters where extreme traditions persist. A clear step is simple. Ask 3 former pledges, off the record, what every week really looks like. Listen for what is routine, not what is polished in recruitment speeches. Look up your school's Hazing Transparency Report and the National Incident Tracker before rush. Public data is expanding right now thanks to new reporting laws. This ensures you're not relying only on rumor, but on the best information available. It's also vital to remember that reporting compliance varies dramatically by state and institution. Some schools release detailed accounts, others disclose very little. The absence of a report is not proof that a chapter is safe. That gap makes informal inquiry even more important. If students describe injuries, sleep deprivation, or normalized humiliation, those are red flags that represent the true cost of admission. Think about the choice like a financial decision. You would compare tuition against future earning power, so weigh the health and time costs of fraternity membership against its potential advantages. Risk factors are not only about health and safety, they extend into academics. Studies show mixed outcomes. Some chapters push members toward lower GPAs in the first year, while others enforce study halls and maintain grades above the campus average. The practical approach is to compare your own workload against the demands of the chapter. If you're a student carrying a challenging major with lab hours or writing-intensive classes, a fraternity that runs nightly events may stretch your schedule past the breaking point. The one-line step here: write down how many hours you actually need for classwork each week. Then compare it against the hours brothers describe for house commitments. If that total exceeds what you can manage, the math becomes clear. You'll risk significant academic decline. The second part of the framework is value alignment. Everything about time in a fraternity will reinforce or erode the goals and ethics a student cares about. Some fraternities genuinely prioritize philanthropy or career mentorship. Others devote themselves almost entirely to parties and social capital. Membership works when goals align, and tension builds when they don't. The best advice: watch what a chapter does repeatedly, not what it promises once. Look at budgets, event calendars, and repeat behavior. If most of the year is devoted to fundraising and community events, that's a reliable signal. If planning parties dominates the calendar, that's the true identity, no matter what is printed in brochures. Students must also weigh ethical alignment. Some organizations carry reputations for elitism, discriminatory traditions, or exclusivity. For students who care about inclusivity or social justice, joining into conflict with those values creates cognitive dissonance. Members often end up defending practices they would otherwise reject, simply because leaving feels too costly after investment. Establishing alignment beforehand prevents that spiral. The step is straightforward. List the 3 values you prioritize most, and ask whether the chapter has evidence, not just statements, that it upholds them. If that evidence is missing, conflict is almost certain later. The third step is recognizing bias. Human decision-making is rarely neutral, and Greek life thrives on unconscious pulls. Belonging itself is the most powerful one. The craving for instant identity makes it difficult to notice red flags. The response is not to suppress that craving, but to name it. Acknowledge openly that the draw is about recognition. Then check if the chapter offers genuine community or simply exploits the need. A fast action: name the specific emotional pulls influencing you: status, fear of exclusion, or the pride of earning membership. And write down 2 stop rules you'll use if they appear. Status works as another distorting force. The promise of reward after. Hardship can disguise dangerous practices. Hierarchies inside fraternities elevate those who endured, and that creates pressure to stay quiet and comply. Before rushing, ask yourself bluntly, am I pursuing this because I want the recognition and perceived prestige? If the answer is yes, then pause. Decide if prestige built mostly on suffering and ritual is actually the kind of recognition you value. By catching that bias early, you protect yourself from mistaking endurance for achievement. Sunk cost bias also strengthens the grip. Once pledging begins, even small investments of time and discomfort accumulate, creating pressure to keep going no matter how unsafe it feels. Bias recognition means anticipating that trap. Decide before you start. What specific conditions would make you walk away? Write those down. If they happen, an injury, sustained sleep deprivation, humiliation broadcast online, you won't have to rationalize in the moment. You'll already have set your own exit rules, making departure a choice of integrity rather than defeat. When students frame their decisions around these 3 layers, risk, values, and biases, they create protection against persuasion techniques baked into recruitment. Recruitment events are designed to flatter, to make students feel special and chosen. Without a framework, those emotions dominate. With one, you can ask sharper questions. Will this compromise my safety? Does it align with the values I hold? Am I being influenced by emotion more than reason? Each question pulls the choice back under personal control rather than leaving it to implicit pressure. Parents can apply the framework too. Blanket warnings about all fraternities being dangerous often break down because students see peers joining and assume parents are exaggerating. But by stepping into the framework, risk, values, and bias, parents can shift the conversation into practical terms. They can ask what the transparency reports for their child's campus reveal, whether stated values match lived behavior, and which psychological pulls their child sees in themselves. That approach respects independence while showing the tools to think critically. For students, applying this structure changes recruitment week from a gut decision into a conscious trade-off. Some will decide the risk is worth it because career networks or aligned values outweigh the drawbacks. Others will conclude it is not worth their GPA, health, or personal ethics. The outcome varies, but the difference is in clarity. Those who follow a framework understand why they made their choice, and that gives the choice weight and stability. To make the framework actionable, here is a final step before any commitment. Set 3 non-negotiables in writing. Decide your academic minimum GPA, state 0 tolerance for hazing, and establish 1 opt-out condition you will act on if crossed. Then take those to chapter leadership and ask directly if they can guarantee them. If they hesitate or hedge, walk away. This transforms recruitment from an emotional gamble into a reasoned contract on your own terms. Using this framework doesn't make the decision simple, but it does make it conscious. And once the choice is conscious, it belongs to the student fully, not to recruiting slogans, not to peer pressure, and not to hidden psychological traps. That clarity matters, because the choice about a fraternity is really a choice about how we let groups shape us. And that question doesn't end with Greek letters. It follows into every institution we'll enter after college. Fraternities are not sustained just by parties. They endure because they meet real needs. Belonging for students, status through hierarchy, housing during growth, and loyalty colleges later depend on from alumni. These pressures align so tightly that the system keeps reproducing itself, even when dangers are obvious. The question is no longer only why fraternities persist, but how we recognize the same forces shaping choices in our own lives. So here's the invitation. Which of the 3 forces, belonging, status, or institutional incentives, surprised you most? Share your insight in the comments. And if this helped you think differently, consider liking or subscribing. Whether you join or not, awareness of these forces is the first step toward choosing consciously, rather than being carried along.